Are you passionate about foreign policy, national security, and the latest in domestic politics? Consider becoming a member of the DSR Network, your go-to source for in-depth analysis and insightful discussions. With the DSR Network podcasts, stay ahead of the curve on global affairs. Each episode features top experts, policymakers, and thought leaders who break down complex issues into digestible, engaging conversations. From breaking news to historical context, we cover the topics that matter most. Whether it's the intricacies of international diplomacy, the latest in national security strategies, or the dynamics of U.S. politics, the DSR Network has you covered. Members receive an ad-free listening experience, bonus content for virtually all of our shows, an invitation to join the DSR Slack community, enhanced show notes for select podcasts, and much more. Visit thedsrnetwork.com/buy and enter code GRADUATE to receive 30% off the regular membership price for the first year or first month. That's thedsrnetwork.com/buy and code GRADUATE. Thank you very much for your support.
Nine, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio, coming to you direct from our super-secret studio in the third sub-basement of the Ministry of Snark in Washington, D.C., and from other undisclosed locations across America and around the world.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Deep State Radio, the mothership, the show in which we look at what's going on in the world. Each and every week we do that with some of our friends who are the smartest people we know, and start with, of course, Dr. Kori Schake, who's at an undisclosed location. But back in the United States, how are you doing, Kori?
I'm exceedingly well. Thank you, David.
Excellent. Exceedingly well, as she has been for 10 years now. And joined also by Ivo Daalder, CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, who says he too is at an undisclosed location.
Yeah, I'm actually in Chicago. And let me tell you, Kori has been doing swell for a lot longer than that, as long as I've known her, which makes both of us really old.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, I agree with that. I just meant 10 years of doing podcasts together, but she's the very best. Another one who is among the very best is Nate Mook, who's the special advisor in Ukraine for the Conflict and Development Foundation and co-founder of the Hachiko Foundation, who has just returned from his work in Ukraine. How are you doing today, Nate?
I'm doing well, David. Great to be with you.
Very glad you could come back and you could join us. Clearly what I'd like to do today is talk about Ukraine. It seems to fall between the cracks too often in discussions here in Washington. The Israel-Gaza conflict has sucked a lot of the oxygen out of the room. And once we got the issue of funding for Ukraine out of the way, it faded a bit. But interestingly, last week, during the commemoration of the D-Day invasion of Europe and the ceremonies that surrounded that, President Zelenskyy of Ukraine appeared and became a kind of a centerpiece, because it became a point that President Biden and others made that the defense of democracy that so many sacrificed for during World War II was continuing through to this day. And right now, among the best examples of that, the fiercest fighting, some of the greatest sacrifices were taking place in Ukraine. So I thought we could get three different perspectives on where we are and then talk a little bit about where we're going. And so just, take a step back, give us your sense of where we are now that this funding has come back. Let me start with you, Kori.
Well, I was in Normandy for the 80th anniversary celebrations, and it was touching to have one of the American veterans who had come ashore on D-Day thank President Zelenskyy for fighting for freedom. It was a really touching moment, and I think is illustrative of how much somebody who risked their life to liberate France, thought about the liberation of Ukraine. This does feel like a really consequential moment. The Russians tried to take advantage of the restricted supplies available to Ukraine during the 6 months it took us to get continued American funding and weapons approved by the Congress. But the Russians were unable to make material progress during that time. I think it's really important that the Biden administration finally relaxed the restrictions on Ukraine being able to use long-range weapons to strike military targets inside Russian territory. That will be incredibly helpful to Ukraine's war effort by pushing the Russians back from the line of contact. So I think actually the worst for Ukraine may be over, and the Russians are, before too much longer, going to have to face the challenge of another round of mobilization of conscripts, and that will probably mean they have to finally conscript in the major cities, which could increase Russian opposition to the war. I think, now that weapons are flowing again to Ukraine has made the hard political choice to extend the range of their own conscription. I think we may look back 2 years from now and think this was the inflection point where Ukraine's victory became apparent.
Well, I hope that's right. By the way, I happened to, on the other day, run into the Ukrainian ambassador, and she said to me that President Zelenskyy was really moved by that moment, really kind of embarrassed to be embraced, but that it really had a deep effect on him. So I just provide a little bit of the other side of that. Nate, you were just in Ukraine. You spent a lot of the past couple of years there. I know that the lack of aid flows was disturbing to you. Is the restoration of aid flows providing a kind of the optimistic view that we're hearing from Kori?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would agree with a lot of what Kori just said. For a many number of months, morale was very low in Ukraine. They were running out of all types of munitions. When I was there in December, brigades were bartering with each other to try to get different rockets for different systems, and they were being outfired. The drones were flying way more from the Russian side than they were from the Ukrainian side. It was quite bad. Now that has shifted. As Kori said, I think this has been a huge moment. I don't know if I would say the Ukrainians have, kind of forgiven, so to speak, the United States for what they saw was many number of months of inaction. But of course, they appreciate it and are grateful for the restoration of the military aid, military support. And a big moment, as Kori mentioned, was the ability to fire longer range into Russian territory. This was a huge thing. I was talking to friends last month, and it was a massive problem. This was their biggest issue because the Russians had amassed forces on the Russian side. They were firing into Ukraine. They were able to get in, take over the city of Volchansk, which is north of Kharkiv, and other villages. And the Ukrainians just simply could not fire back. And the Russians would come across the border, fire, and then go back, retreat back to Russia. My friend who runs a drone battalion out there likened it to a scene in the movie Braveheart, where one of the sides, the two sides are sort of facing each other, and one of the sides pulls their pants down and kind of is making fun of the other side and showing his butt. And this is what he felt the Russians were doing to the Ukrainians, basically saying, "You can't hit us, ha 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 ha." Now that has changed, and it is making. I talked to friends right on the front lines in Kharkiv this morning, and they said that they are able to really keep the Russians from moving further forward. They are not able to dislodge them from the territory that was lost in Kharkiv, but they have stopped them from moving forward. And at the same time, they've been able to basically keep hitting. Now, the Russians, as we've seen for many, many months, just keep sending men over and over and over again, and they're sort of like zombies. And so, but now that they have the weapons, they are able to fire back. I will say that there's a lot more to be done. Right now, my friend said they're able to hit about 84 kilometers. That's the distance that they can hit into across the border. And in the distance of the HIMARS, they are not allowed to use the longer range ATACMS missiles that we've heard so much about in Russian territory. So he did say this is still a major problem. They're not able to hit the command centers, and they're not able to hit the surface-to-air missiles that the Russians have to shoot down any Ukrainian planes and other things that would be very useful. So it's not solved, but definitely a step in the right direction.
Ivo, what's your take? And I'd be really interested in your comment on Nate's last point there.
Yeah, I my take is I hope Kori and Nate are right, but I'm not sure they are. I'm significantly more pessimistic. I actually do think the last 6 months has been a real big loss, and it's a loss in two ways. One, of course, is the absence of the weaponry and the ability to defend. Which has cost the Ukrainians dearly. The number of Ukrainian casualties, it's something we don't talk about, but the number of Ukrainian casualties are significant. The second problem is that Kori is right that Zelenskyy has finally started the mobilization or lower the conscription age, but it's lowered from 27 to 25. There's no war that I know of in which 18 to 25-year-olds don't fight. This is still a war in which the overwhelming majority of people are fathers and in their 30s and 40s. The average age on the front line is 43. It'll come down slowly, but it's going to take a long time. The Ukrainian system is actually not prepared to train and equip enough forces and to train them with the kinds of equipment that they need to do the right kinds of training. To even match their losses, let alone start to build up the force. Right now, they do about 12,000 troops a month. They need to do 3 times as much. And so you have the combination of a lack of manpower and a lack of or the absence for too long of sufficient ammunitions. And it's going to still take time to get the stuff not only to the front, but distributed to the right units at the right time. That Ukraine is one mistake away from really suffering a big loss. They have so far not made a mistake, which is great, and you hope so. But they are so thin that if the Russians probe in a different area, they sent the wrong numbers of people to defend there, and in fact there was a fake, they go somewhere else, the possibility of some significant breakthrough is there. That's number one. Number two is I think we are focusing on the wrong thing when we focus on the front line. I don't think this is a war that is ultimately about who controls what kilometer of territory. I think this is fundamentally a war about who controls, who has the capacity and the will to continue to fight to the end. Now, I have no doubt that the Ukrainians have the will. The goal of the Russians is to destroy their capacity, and they're doing it not by taking territory, but by massively destroying lots of stuff that the Ukrainians have, and they're outnumbered. They're outnumbered in artillery. Even if we sent all the artillery that we can, they still have 2 to 3 times as much artillery as the Ukrainians. They are flying drones behind the front lines. That has not changed because the air defense systems aren't in place. And then finally, and most importantly, they have gained huge strategic advantage by bombing cities and civilian infrastructure. Zelenskyy said yesterday in Berlin that half of the energy generation capacity has been destroyed. That's not replaceable. You don't walk in tomorrow and build a new power plant. And so winter looks dire without significant aid. So my view is that while I hope that Kori and Nate are right, I want our leaders to think that they're wrong, because I want our leaders to come together in a month at the 75th anniversary of NATO and actually take Biden's words that this is existential, that Ukraine succeeding and Russia failing is fundamental to the future of our security. I want to make them real, because we're certainly not acting like that. We're certainly not acting as if this is a war that we cannot afford to lose. And I would argue that the future of NATO, something I care deeply about, depends on what happens in Ukraine. If we fail in Ukraine, it doesn't matter anymore. Our security will be negatively affected. That was the import of the speech. So how can you give a speech on the one hand and then say, but you can't use ATACMS against the Russian command centers and the airfields from which Russian airplanes are flying? And you can't, when we send F-16s, you can't use those F-16s against this or that. I mean, this idea of, if we're not going to be willing to fight ourselves for our own security, but we're allowing the Ukrainians to do it, can we at least allow them to do it with both hands on the barrel, as opposed to one hand tied behind their back? And to start thinking about, how do we make this real? So maybe I'm overstating the case, but I'm overstating the case because I think that the need for us to act, to make sure that this is not a NATO summit where we fight about NATO management, NATO membership for Ukraine, which, I'm in favor of, but it's not going to happen tomorrow, so it doesn't matter. That's for after the war. It's not for in the war. And instead, make sure that everyone is united on the issue that you cannot fail in Ukraine.
I was wondering which direction you were going with your pessimism, Ivo. And just personally, I want to say I was delighted that it was in the service of providing more support to Ukraine and untying their hands. Kori, what's your reaction to what Ivo said?
So I think those are all the right kinds of worries. And it did also strike me, listening to the president in Normandy, how big the gap was between his brave rhetoric and his tentative choices about concern about escalation. I think one of the reasons I'm more optimistic than Ivo is that I believe I see a repeated pattern of America's European allies taking actions. I mean, given especially that they are at greater risk than we are of Russian retaliation, that our European allies, and particularly the British, but also the French, the Danish, the Norwegians, varieties of them led on providing tanks, led on providing aircraft. President Macron is now talking about organizing a multilateral effort to train Ukrainian troops inside Ukraine to free up Ukrainian forces to fight. I do think there is momentum to be able to push us forward. I'd be very interested in Ivo's thoughts about the NATO summit, because it looks to me like the Biden administration has almost zero ambition for anything to happen other than just to clap their hands and say 75 years has been wonderful. And I do share Ivo's worry that unless we keep pushing a policy agenda forward that sustains momentum and sustains Ukrainian hope that they can get their territory back and get themselves squared away and anchored in the West, that Ukraine's going to run out of people before Russia runs out of willingness to fight.
All right. Well, let's flip the order I was going on. Ivo, respond to Kori, then I'll go to Nick.
Yeah, I mean, just on the NATO summit, I think I wouldn't say they lack ambition. I think it's the way it's been approached. So in Vilnius, we had a big debate about whether or not to invite Ukraine into NATO. Every effort has been made to make sure that debate doesn't happen again. And the way to do that, NATO and the U.S. and others have decided, is to demonstrate that the step towards membership is now closer than it was before. And there's a number of actually, I think, quite important and significant decisions that will be taken to create what they're calling a NATO Ukraine mission, which will bring most of not only the current effort to help Ukraine in the Ramstein group and other places under a NATO imprimatur, but also to combine it with the longer term efforts in terms of building a Ukrainian future force. And all of this is going to be under a NATO umbrella and sort of building what the administration calls this bridge that is both well lit and strong. I think that's great. I think it's very important. It just doesn't address the moment. The moment, in fact, is what are we going to do now to make sure that Ukraine succeeds? And I think the best thing that the administration and NATO can do is to come out of the summit and saying we are 100% committed, not just to be there for, quote, as long as it takes, but until Russia fails in Ukraine, until Ukraine succeeds. If you want to use the word win, go ahead, use the word win, although I don't know what that means. But in essence, making clear that when we say as long as it takes, it means that Russia will, in the end of the day, be seen as having failed. Seen in Russia as having failed, seen in Ukraine as having failed, seen in Europe as having failed, seen around the world as having failed. Because that is the core. And we have not been willing to make that clear. Then, once you make that clear, as I think Biden did in some ways in Normandy, what follows is that you have now given guidance to the Pentagon to say, all right, this is a priority that is very much on the top of our priority. And as you think about what weapons are available and what you can send and how to do it, put Ukraine higher on the priority. I note, for example, that last week they sent a Patriot battery. Incredibly important to have done so. Should have done it months ago. And the reason it wasn't done is because we were keeping it back for the Middle East. And now the priority has been increased. So that is where I think we need to go.
I will also note as a footnote for listeners that following a trend that I'm sure Ivo is fully supportive of, our U.S. ambassador to NATO, Julian Smith, has been nominated to be the number 3 person in the State Department. And that will bring useful expertise into the job, and she is very capable. Nate, I'd like to go back to another point that Ivo made, and this is the effect on the people of Ukraine of the destruction of Ukraine's infrastructure, like the power infrastructure. You've been involved in helping to get people fed. You've seen what has happened in the cities that have fallen under these Russian onslaughts that really make them unlivable. Is that taking a toll on Ukrainian morale? If so, how? If not, why not?
Yeah, it's a great question because we've seen a surge in these attacks in the last months. A lot of it correlated to Ukraine's inability to respond because it didn't have the necessary weaponry. It's a massive problem, especially in the east. And even today, there's a big attack in the southern city of Kryvyi, which is where President Zelenskyy is from. I have no doubt that was not intentional with Zelenskyy recently out in Europe and in Berlin for the Ukraine Recovery Conference that's going on. And that's a separate discussion, whether we should be really going deep into recovery before we even help Ukraine stop more destruction. But you are seeing the impact of that. As Ivo noted, huge swaths of the energy infrastructure has been destroyed and will need to be replaced, not just fixed. Friends in Kyiv right now don't have electricity for much of the day. Kharkiv is especially hit bad. And once winter comes, it's not clear how much heat there's going to be because of the way the centralized heating systems work in these old Soviet cities. We have a food train that we built that was intended to kind of go around and support communities. And it's actually been in Kharkiv the last 3 months cooking for displaced families because they don't have the electricity to be able to prepare meals. And so it is really having an impact on the ground. We're seeing the morale of the people. At the same time, I think going back to what Ivo was saying before, I am optimistic about the Ukrainian people and their ability to continue to fight this, because it is existential. This battle is existential for them. But I'm also a realist, and I think there are some big challenges ahead of us. And while this was a huge step in the right direction to provide the supplemental aid package and enable Ukraine to defend itself as it needs to, there's still some really key questions that are outstanding. One of them being, as Ivo mentioned, mobilization. It is a massive issue right now on the ground. And that, coupled with the energy attacks, as you mentioned, David, make it very difficult. Imagine you were a parent in Ukraine right now and you had to decide what to do with your kid going to school. You can't send your kid to school properly, not only because of the air raid sirens and missile attacks, but the schools may not have electricity. Also, if you have a teenager, some really tough decisions are being made right now by parents in Ukraine, including parents that are at the front lines fighting, including friends of mine, who have to decide whether to send their kids out of Ukraine. Because right now, if you, when you, after 17 and you have to register as part of the mobilization, even though you're not going to fight until a later age, you're kind of trapped. You're not able to leave. And so, you've got parents now that have to keep their children out of the country. And that, of course, just all of these circumstances have a big knock-on effect on morale. So there are massive challenges. I think a second big challenge is the financial state of Ukraine. As part of this supplemental aid package, there was a huge chunk of that went to the Ukrainian budget, so they could pay pensions, they could pay staff, they could continue to operate the country. From what I've been hearing, it is, even if there is a future supplemental package of weapons or support going to Ukraine, there's unlikely to be any additional cash to the Ukrainians. And so just keeping the country functional is going to be a really difficult challenge. And so I'd say, again, there's a lot of concern. There's a lot of issues. I'm optimistic, but I'm certainly a realist about the situation. And the one last point I'll note, because I'm curious Ivo's thought on this, but talking to a friend today in Kharkiv region, he was really quite frustrated that the NATO planes in Poland, which are now being activated every time Russia sends missiles to Western Ukraine, these NATO planes take off from Rzeszów in Poland near the border, and they go and they monitor to make sure these missiles fired from Russia are not going to land in Poland. And they're monitoring them. They know where these missiles are going. They know they're in the air, and they know they're going to hit and kill civilians. And what my friend said is, if these Polish jet fighters have the ability to shoot down these missiles and choose not to, aren't they complicit in allowing Russia to bomb innocent civilians? And at what point can NATO step up? Is shooting a missile out of the air really an escalation? So I'm curious that, if we can see, certainly we're not going to see Ukraine invited into NATO while the war is going on, but what steps could be taken, could NATO take to assist here?
Let me go to Ivo, and maybe you can respond to Nate's question, Ivo.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, and I know that President Zelenskyy raised it in the interview in the New York Times in the same way. And I think the question your friend asks is exactly the right question. Why shouldn't if you can shoot it down when it crosses the border, why not shoot it down before it crosses the border if you know it's going to explode in Lviv? It's not easy, by the way. This is not easily done. But to the extent it can be done, it should be done. I joined an international task force that Hillary Clinton was part of, but that chaired by former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen and the head of the president's office, Andrei Yermak, and we argued that we should be doing this, and I think we should be doing this. I think we just demonstrated a few weeks ago what our defensive capacity is when we defended. We, not only the U.S., but the Brits and the French and the Jordanians, defended Israel. We shot down more than half of all the missiles before they even got to those that actually made it off the launch pad. We shut down more than half of those missiles before they entered Israeli airspace. We can do the same. There's no reason why we shouldn't do the same, and it's as defensive as you can possibly get. Using NATO air to go after the air bases or the missile defense sites in Russia that are launching against Ukraine, man, that's a step. But shooting down missiles that are being rained down on the people of Ukraine, that's what good people do. They defend innocence against the targeting from an aggressive force. And I think there's nothing wrong under Article 51 of the UN Charter. You can actually argue that we should do this.
There are a number of reasons why the rebuilding issue is on the table now. One is it's going to cost a lot of money, and it's important to start the process of raising it. Number two is that number of things need to be rebuilt for the future of Ukraine, the survival of Ukraine. And there's a third reason, which is that the more we spend time focused on the rebuilding and perhaps actually bring in, international companies and so forth to rebuild, it does afford a certain kind of security for the parts of Ukraine where those people reside and where the rebuilding is done. It certainly says, the world is here with Ukraine. What's the view, Nate, in Ukraine about this idea of reconstruction and moving it to the front burner?
So I'd say overall, people are very positive about this, right? I mean, this is very important. Ukrainians want to be able to function as a country. Businesses go on. You go to even in Kramatorsk, which is in the east and essentially a frontline city. Businesses operate. People go to cafes. People go to restaurants. People are still living there. And so, of course, it's very important that Ukraine continues to function as a state, even while it is in this war. I do think there are a lot of questions, though, that have been raised. There's been some shifts of ministers. The Vice Prime Minister of Infrastructure was relieved of his post. The Deputy Minister who ran the Agency for Restoration resigned a day before the Berlin Recovery Conference. It's not too unusual because usually when a minister leaves, the deputies also transition off. But it was quite a high profile defection from somebody who, quite a high profile departure rather from somebody who really has played a critical role in Ukraine's for over the past decade, Mustafa Nayyem. And so I think these questions do surface where the Ukrainians are sort of, are concerned about the state of things. And they also want to make sure that these conferences really do serve a purpose. Whether this is just a lot of politicians going out and shaking hands while the people in Ukraine are suffering. I asked a friend at the front about this today, actually, and he said that although he certainly had questions about, whether we are distracted by reconstruction and recovery while not focusing on defense and protection, ultimately he was happy anytime the world got together and talked about Ukraine, right? He was concerned that this issue would just fade away into the background, especially with the U.S. election on the horizon. And so any excuse for us to talk about Ukraine, the better. So he was ultimately supportive, but certainly there are some questions on this and the best way to do it. It's a tricky thing. This, these recovery conferences got sparked. They originally sort of came from talking about reform. And after Kharkiv and Kherson were liberated in 2022, and Ukraine had this huge momentum moving forward, there was this idea, well, let's start talking about, now we got to start rebuilding these places that we've liberated and taken back and start getting life to come back to them. Kherson is now a dead city because it is just across the river from the Russian forces. And very little major reconstruction projects have gotten underway, although we've done some projects and I've been involved in a number of them. And so, I think that these conferences were started at a moment where Ukraine had this tremendous momentum and it looked like they might win the war in a very short period of time, at least from some perspectives. That is, of course, shifted now, as Ivo has so eloquently discussed. And so, It's a tough question. It's a tough question, but I think ultimately the Ukrainians see this as an important conversation to be having.
Let me ask one last question to you, Ivo. And typically, as last questions go, inevitably they're like, we have just a couple minutes, so let me ask you a question. We'll take a day to answer, right? But in this particular case, we look forward to this NATO summit, but those of us here in the United States look at it and say, will this be the last NATO summit? And we look forward, or we look ahead, and we see elections in Europe that are a little unsettling. The European Parliament elections showed some gains, not as much as people thought might happen, but some gains for the right, enough gains for the French right, for Macron to call a snap election. And now you have in France the unwelcome alliance between their conservative party and the far right, which makes a bigger role for them in the government more likely. Now, the right in Europe has been a bit of a mix. Some are close enough to Russia that they've been an obstacle. Orban has been an obstacle. Meloni in Italy is part of the right, but she's been helpful in encouraging support for Ukraine, pushing Orban in that direction. As you take the temperature of the politics of NATO, is it trending in a direction that worries you about this, this issue, Ukraine, and security more broadly?
It worries me in terms of what's happening in our country, because clearly we have two candidates who have very different views about NATO, about alliances, frankly, about Russia and Ukraine. And it does matter which of those two candidates win. And the U.S., which has for the last 80 years been the country that everyone looks at to chart the course, to lead the pack, is going to be a very different country if Donald Trump wins. Which is, we can talk about that at another thing. But that's point one. Point two, I'm less worried about Europe. Interestingly enough, as you said, the center right, the far right did well, increased from 20 to 25% of the seats, but so did the center. The center held. And importantly about the center holding is that Ursula von der Leyen, who is the likely future European Commission president, has made very clear that she's not doing any coalition with anybody who is not 100% in the Ukrainian camp. And the message has gone out. You want to work with me? You want to work with the center? You got to be pro-Ukraine. And the far right is deeply split, just as you mentioned, David, between those who are sort of pro-Russia and those who are pro-Ukraine. One of the reasons that Meloni, who was the big victor, by the way, out of this election, one of the very few who increased her overall percentage compared to her national vote a couple of years ago, one of the reasons Meloni has said that she doesn't want to work with Le Pen and the far right is because they're wrong on Russia and they're wrong on Ukraine. So I'm relatively optimistic. I know that Orban, by the way, had a shellacking. He only got some 40% of the vote, which is great. Stoltenberg was the NATO Secretary General was in Hungary just today, in which the Hungarians said that they would not participate in Ukrainian aid that NATO would do, but, and this is the really important thing, they would not stop NATO from doing it. And that's how NATO works. It's as long as you don't stop people from doing things, you get stuff done. We don't need Hungary's money or people, frankly, to help Ukraine. What we need to make sure is that Hungary doesn't veto that effort. And I think we're moving in a direction where, at least when it comes to Ukraine, and possibly in terms of NATO, again, depending on what happens on November 5th here, I'm relatively optimistic that the future is brighter than many of us would have thought just a few weeks ago.
See what we did there, Nate? We pulled Ivo around. He started out being pessimistic, and we found something that made him a little bit optimistic. I know Kori would feel a job well done, since her job here at Deep State Radio for the course of the past decade has been to be the holder of the tiara of optimism and the one who advanced positive arguments whenever she could. So I'm grateful to all of you for this discussion. I'm so glad to have the opportunity to air these issues. with an audience like ours that really cares about them. And obviously, we'll track these things closely, and perhaps we'll get all you folks together after the NATO summit to talk a little bit about what that means. For now, thank you, Ivo. Thank you, Kori. Thank you, Nate. And thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll be back with more podcasts each and every day, so join us then. Until then, bye-bye.